Merci d'être là. On va parler d'un sujet pas du tout anecdotique, peut-être l'un des plus importants de ce congrès, qui est
about something that is not a trifle, one of the most important issues of this Congress, standards, and the MCIS standard. There are many countries involved, many sectors involved, and the idea is really to bring together several languages, cultures, but to talk about the passion for the job and to talk about the same standards. Kenneth CREIGHTON is going to talk about this. He's the professional director. MUSE, who's the director for construction standards at DIREX. PAPARELLA. He's the main director for the inner market for the VME, and Pascal ASSELIN is the chairman of Untec and leader of a company for the economy of construction. So here, the floor. Well, all the speakers we have will give us some very interesting opinions, and that's quite representative of what the Untec does, because we bring together several structures like the NCC or the...
Cyril, you have some headset next door for those who need some translation.
Okay, so it's an international co-production, so we have different cultures, different jobs that are being represented here, and the idea of convergence has to do with standards. Pascal, you're one of our important guests. The first time we met, you talked about ICMS. You had just come back from Washington. How would you define ICMS? Is it a standard? Is it a calculation method? What is it? Well, a standard is a word that we love in France because it has to do with regulations. In the world, the word standard is vastly used, even though in French we use the word norme. And I'd never met so many people from different countries as than the time when I went with Untec to Washington, and I met many colleagues from the construction sector, and they all had a common ambition. Not necessarily building bridges between the various associations, but really trying to build a common language. And I thought that was a very interesting idea, because I had already tried to test this thing within the CEC, and it had taken us about 20 years to create a sort of construction code, a common construction code. There are as many languages in Europe as there are as the number of countries, of member states, and each country had its own translator. So every time a person asked a question, it took quite some time for the answer to arrive. Today, this is all over, everybody can speak English, and it allows us to have very smooth exchanges. And what I'm proud of is that the job that we did in Washington to create the ICMS was done in only 4 years. So this is a common language, a common alphabet. You talked about a common dimension. I'm sure that Pascal could confirm the fact that the CEC is working actively for years on this subject. Are you considering something that goes beyond the European community, the European Commission? You're trying to define this common language, right? Yes, indeed. And not only for that sector. We are working on the standardization of all this. The idea is really to find a common language for various sectors. That's what we're doing, for instance, for construction products, construction materials, with standards that we've been creating for about 20 years. And we are also working in the construction field, using Eurocodes, which are standards for the design and construction of buildings. And there are other initiatives that are being undertaken, other than the ones that had been launched by the Commission, those that stem from the sector, the industry itself. Many approaches that we want to support, rather than having only a normative approach. The idea is really to have all the stakeholders from the industry to be mobilized and to manage to put in place all the filters that could help this common language. So you're trying to initiate this work, and how would you deploy it? Do you have to work all together with the European Commission, for instance?
Yes, it's a very good point. The work we're doing is really for the marketplace, and it's important for the profession to think about who the real customer is. And the real customer is not the professionals, it's the customers of the professionals, it's the clients. And so, absolutely, the European Commission, for example, as a leading government entity in the world that would be advantaged from this work. Fundamentally, what we're doing is we're trying to create trust in the marketplace through consistency of information. So all these projects, around the world, trillions of dollars are being spent on infrastructure today. Huge plans. The movement of people from rural to urban centers is something that the world has never seen. You hear about places like India building a city the size of Chicago every year for the next 26 years. And the need for good quality information to make good business decisions is vital. And that is really fundamentally what we're trying to enable this profession to do. So an entity like the European Commission, which is so vital in our world economy, needs to make good decisions about investment in these types of projects. And so what we're doing with ICMS is we're creating a framework, and it's enabling people to compare information. And it's one thing to be able to cost a project and give numbers, but if somebody else in a different project is costing it a different way, those two numbers can't be compared. It's just very, very basic things. So, for example, I do a lot of cycling around London, and there's a big project going on called HS2, high-speed rail between London and Birmingham. And part of the area where I cycle, people are against it, and there's big signs that says, stop HS2, it'll cost 60 billion pounds. Then there are other people who are promoting this project, and they say it'll cost 6 billion pounds, okay? There's a big difference between 6 and 60. And you can have your own opinions, but you can't have your own facts. And we as professionals need to provide people facts on which to make good decisions. So it's really not acceptable for somebody to say it'll cost 6 and another person to say it'll cost 60. That's just, we're not talking about the same facts. I think we have a problem worldwide right now with facts. Professions can help with this. And so we want to give people facts so they can sit down at the table and have good, informed arguments, discussions, agreements about what's right and what we do. So for example, somebody like Antonio's important position, if our profession is providing the European Commission with good, consistent data, they can make better decisions. And that's better for the taxpayer. And that's good for our profession, because that's how we instill confidence and respect. So fundamentally, that's what this project aims to do.
Antonio, so you're working hand in hand with the RICS, the centre, and all the stakeholders of the sector, and you try to maintain operational, concrete operational logic, not necessarily a top-down logic. So do you play the part of an advisor, a consultant? Are you trying to make them think out of the box? Could you create a sort of European Commission label? What's your role when when you want to really collaborate with the RICS? For the moment, we are taking part in the RICS's work. The work of the RICS could take the shape of something bigger. It could develop itself, and yeah, it could take the shape of something a bit more informal, like recommendations within the frame of our public markets, guidelines.
Des guidelines.
Here it could be the most basic thing. But then could the Commission, for instance, as far as the public markets are concerned, it was done at some point. Could the Commission take into account the costs of certain expenses and impose directives, guidelines? We're not there yet. But we did a lot of work on the matter of the cost of the life cycle of certain constructions, considering how this could be applied in public markets. And before we achieve the stage of guidelines and so on, we might have to walk different paths that could be a bit more flexible. Like recommendation. And then there's always a sort of middle ground to consider. But in the end, the finality is to rationalize the whole thing and to build the confidence of the investors in order to help the market. Yes, indeed. And this is an axis that we have to explore within the frame of all the investment levers that we have at our disposals through the European Investment Bank or regional funds. The idea is really to consider how we could be more consistent as far as the decisions that we are making to finance such or such projects are concerned. Here we're not just talking about risks regarding the cost of a decision. Is it going to cost, for instance, 100 million or 60 million? I think that the idea is also to have to be coherent when it comes to our policies in the fields in which we invest. If we are to invest in the energy transition field or in the circular economy, what can we do? And if the reference point is not clear, then the decisions won't be clear either. So there's a difference between private and public investors. One could think that investors are more confident when there is an ICMS standard than when the project doesn't show any standard. Is it obvious?
Ça peut être un critère de décision de go no go de la part d'un investisseur. Il y a la norme ICMS, donc c'est clair.
I don't know. When there's an ICMS standard, it seems to be clearer.
Comment vous voyez Alan MUSE, je sais pas
Alan MUSE, what's your point of view at the RICS? Because you've been working on the development and the promotion of this standard. Are investors reassured when there is the ICMS standards? Do you receive more investments and investments?
Yes, I think the short answer is a number of global institutions have looked at research into investment in construction and, in fact, have challenged the industry in terms of its efficiency and performance. Most of those studies have showed that consistent standards on an international basis are part of the problem. And that was one reason we embarked upon ICMS in the first place. So I think the case is proven in terms of extensive studies from the McKinsey Institute, from the World Economic Forum, and from our own in-house studies that actually consistent standards applied particularly to a fragmented and often inefficient construction industry must benefit the industry overall, and more importantly, in answer to your question, benefit investment in that industry and make the construction industry a more investable industry. And I think it's well known actually from these studies that, in answer to Ken's point about private sector investment in infrastructure, that there is a huge private sector infrastructure gap. So in fiscally constrained environments that we now have in the Western world and many other countries, if we are going to build the infrastructure that we need to build as a society, then clearly we need to attract much more private sector investment. And quite often that needs to be done in the context of a whole life approach, as Antonio has just mentioned. So if we are going to adopt that approach as governments and societies, we need to think much more about how we compare and contrast large projects across the world, and in fact not only that, but also unify the thinking in terms of the financial management of construction, which is one of the tacit aims of ICMS, because the financial management of construction is done by different professionals in different marketplaces, and we need to build a unified common body of knowledge for that profession as well, and obtain higher recognition for that profession in terms of the effect it can have on delivering projects on time and on budget. So I think those raison d'etres, if you like, to use a French phrase, are well known in terms of the investment in construction. But I think going back to Antonio's point in terms of the influence of the European Commission, we need to think about two things there, because we've had the same discussions with other governments and institutions around the world. And those two issues are one, institutions themselves and governments themselves procure a lot of construction work. In the UK government procures 40% of the construction economy. So they can directly influence consultant appointments and contractor appointments in terms of the use of a standard like ICMS. And we obviously think that they should do so. And secondly, in terms of general industry performance, which benefits society as a whole, even if they cannot stipulate the use of ICMS in that industry, they can certainly nudge the market, as it's called, in terms of recommending and encouraging the use of ICMS to improve industry performance, which must ultimately benefit the taxpayer and society. And I think in terms of accountability and in terms of the noise, if you like, that surrounds public construction performance, that anything that can be seen to be improving that performance must be good. Must be a good thing for institutions like the European Commission and other governments to actually do.
Ken CREIGHTON, regarding the link between, with investors and the impact on investors.
Yeah, investors and the impact of investors. If I could address another point before I get to that,
sure.
Bear with me. I think it's important to clarify the roles of a lot of the different organizations that have been mentioned. So, for example, RICS has been mentioned and ICMS Coalition. I think it's very important to put the context of how this has been put together. I want to be very clear that RICS is only one of 48 members of the ICMS Coalition. And so I want to be crystal clear that RICS does not have a special role at all in this coalition. And I think it's very important to make that point and just make that very clear for a few reasons. One reason is that many of our partners in the coalition are here in this room right now, and I want to recognize that from all over the world. And we are just one of the equal partners. Also, I think that the main thing that's unique about this standard and this project is how we have worked together to do it. So all the comments that have been made, it's my opinion that those would be put in a category of course that's the right thing to do, right? Okay, nobody's going to argue against having good, consistent information, right? If anybody wants to argue against that, I would love to have that discussion. I'd be fascinated, because I've never heard somebody argue for that. However, doing this is very hard. And the reason why it's hard is because of the politics. And that is the unspoken reality of why we didn't do this 10, 20, 30, 50 years ago, and we should have. It's because it's very difficult to get different people, different organizations to work together to create a shared standard. That's very hard to do. And so, and because of that, I'm very sensitive to when people say, you know, ICMS and RICS, and I want to be very clear that RICS has an equal role in this. Now, what we've done, and this started, as Pascal said, when we launched this event in Washington at the International Monetary Fund, is we spoke with, you know, our colleagues from all over the world, and literally all over the world, every region, and said, why don't we start from scratch? And nobody's going to be advantaged here. We're not going to start with the RICS standard. We're not going to start with the Canadian standard or the Chinese standard. We're going to work together to create a shared standard that we all literally own. And it was through working together and creating that trust, which is, it's a legal fact, we all own the IP together, that we're creating this standard. And I think that every other effort in this regard throughout history has been, if you will, kind of unequal in that regard. There's always been an organization that says, well, actually, I'd prefer to do it my way. and that causes a political problem that keeps us from the benefits that we've been talking about. So I just want to make that point very clear. That is the basis, I think, of the success we've been able to generate.
Thank you again. You talked about Washington. It was in 2015, I think. It's still work in process. The ICMS is still work in process, but it's a tool. It's a predominant tool when you have to work on the life cycle analysis of construction, because the whole point is to determine the global cost of all this. So there's a link between the ICMS and the life cycle analysis, right? It's a tool that you use in order to determine the life cycle cost. Yes, that's an excellent question, because we are at the beginning of data wars. Here I'm talking about a war because, well, it's a tug of war, really. But that's actually reassuring. We created a standard using the Untec method that was created about 40 years ago. Here we're talking about a way to classify the different stages of a project. And our method, this method, just like the French playwright Molière said when he talked about writing verse without knowing how to. The idea here is really to make sure that everybody understands each other. And ICMS is really close to our method. And the idea is really to understand classification. And this tool was made to reassure the market, not to impose anything on anyone, but to reassure the market. You heard what Alan, Ken, and Antonio said. It is essential. They do have very down-to-earth perceptions of all this. We're not talking about a European subject. For instance, I've got Kwan sitting just in front of me from Malaysia. We also have people from the US, from China, and they all have an interest in all this. We all have a common destiny. How many countries are we talking about?
How many countries in the coalitions? 19.
It's a good question. There are 48 different organizations, and many of them span political borders. So it's how many? You know, every country. I mean, if you look at the reach of all the organizations in the coalition, there isn't a country on the planet that isn't touched, because a lot of the organizations in the coalition are multinational.
See? So that's quite impressive. And it's here to reassure investors. And it actually happened to me. There were British investors that renovate heritage buildings, for instance, luxury hotels in France and so on. And I was actually in competition with colleagues from London because investors didn't trust our standards. See? So But it reassured them, right? Well, if tomorrow we were to apply the ICMS standards, we could be on the same level. It could be also a way to boost the market. The market is open in any case. Whether you want it or not, the market is open. There are investors investing in China or Japan or England or France. So the stakes here are all about reassuring investors. When investors want to follow a project, they need comparative tools. And when you start working on construction, on building life cycle analysis, you have to have the same standards. This is essential. Since we're heading towards the division into phases of the construction sector, because this is where we're headed, ICMS will become more and more essential. So the idea really is to promote it. This is what you're doing at Untec, at the RICS, the European Commission. Here we're talking about ICMS. Just like Ken said, the RICS has a global platform. The idea is really to make things easier. Each country that's a member of the coalition has the same weight when it comes to voting, and there was a real work as partners.
So when we have constructions in a country, we want to use ICMS. Do we have to be having a member of the BRICS in one's own country? So who decides between the business, the professional branch federations, or the states? Well, the BRICS is equivalent to the UBKK in the Netherlands or Untec in France. So what is the level of use of these, because we have 8,400 businesses in France involved in the economies with an economist of construction. So what is the level of and the trend of so using ICMS within projects? Well, for the time being, that's nil, because the French translation of the document has just been completed. So this from Adam Construction, IPMS, ICMS, and you know, this event has been under the aegis of this. Untec is here to take forward this common projects with all the countries. So I think it will happen slowly as time goes by, and there shouldn't be any particular obstacles. There's an awareness-raising challenge, promotion challenge as well, because it seems quite relevant. So this is kind of version 1, Washington, this is the 2017 version. What about the second version, the second draft? Will there be work in cooperation, you know, when it comes to the measurement of life cycle in terms of the version 1?
Yes, that should be published next year, life cycle costing. The Standard Setting Committee have started to work on that project, and we should have it ready by the end of this calendar year in draft, and then it will go out for public consultation. That's a very important addition to the original publication of last year, because a number of institutions, including the European Commission, the UK government, the Canadian government and others have said that the addition of life cycle costing will be a major addition to ICMS. So the Standard Setting Committee are looking forward to working together over the next year to produce and publish that paper next year, that standard next year. I think one of the issues here is that life cycle costing is not that well developed in many places of the world, but actually it needs to be well developed because of procurement systems, particularly in terms of P3 in the Americas or private finance initiative, as it's known in Europe, is gaining traction in the market, because it goes back to this issue I talked about before, where governments need to attract private sector money to build the infrastructure and affordable housing and meet the urbanisation needs that have already been discussed. So the issue is PFI as a procurement system, or P3 as a procurement system, is here to stay. That demands better data for forecasting life cycle costs, and it demands better early design decisions in terms of which materials to use. In order to make those decisions, we need a comprehensive and consistent international standard. And this is where extending ICMS 1 into ICMS 2 and producing this new standard will actually meet the demands of the governments and end users here, to extend the use of the standard in the marketplace and make it even more useful for investors and construction stakeholders.
Kenneth CREIGHTON?
I think my French is getting better. I understood everything he said. There was a question about market take-up, market adoption, and we've had a lot of success. And let me give some examples and put this in context. First of all, we're talking primarily now about international construction measurement standards, but we also have sibling projects done exactly the same way, covering land. So international land measurement standards, also with a coalition. It was launched at the World Bank, and this covers about how you report land data. And then international property measurement standards, which is about measuring the physical space of a room or a building like this one. And ICMS, of course, also ethics. We're doing related projects in fire safety, building control, also business valuation. Now, as far as market adoption goes, I think if you look at the adoption and success of these projects, I think if there were such thing as world records, we'd be setting them. Now, IPMS, the Property Measurement Standards Coalition, is about 2 years ahead of construction. It was launched in 2013. There are just over 350 companies that are now using that standard all over the world, and governments that are using that standard. And so there's some very specific stories we can tell about take-up. And then when it comes to ICMS, we have also had, that standard, it is being used in many places around the world. There's transactions, people are paying for it and delivering for it in a business context. I'll give you some examples. We launched ICMS, the first version, life cycle is coming, but the first version in July of last year at the PAQS CIQS event in Vancouver. And a couple months before the launch, and this is all public information now, but Turner & Townsend, one of the major global service providers, contacted us and said, look, we've had a request for proposal from the UK government, and the UK government had a problem where they call it the 5 families. They have Highways England, HS2, Transport for London, all these different companies within the Department for Transport. And the problem is that a new minister would come into government and would say to all these 5 families, how much does this cost? Something, whatever it is. And they'd get an answer from one of those groups. And then they'd get a different answer from another group, and a different answer from another part of the Department of Transport. They didn't know cost between the different agencies of government. And so the ministers politically would say, well, I like the cheaper number. So everything's going to be, that's all I'm paying across the board. And so the government had this real problem where they didn't know their own costs. And so Turner & Townsend asked us, they said, we want to bid for this work. And we know that ICMS is not finished yet, but could we please have permission to write our whole proposal for this work based on ICMS? And we said, yeah, take the risk that, Jerry and Alan and Celia and all the standard setting committee is not finished yet. It might change, but go for it. And they won the work, and they're delivering that. I mean, Jerry O'Sullivan is here from Ireland, who's on the standard setting committee, and Ireland did a major comparison of the cost of housing across Europe using ICMS. The Welsh government is adopting ICMS. The Emirates, there have been meetings recently in Dubai and other Emirates, they're adopting ICMS. And probably the best example is in Canada, Infrastructure Ontario. And Craig Bai is here from CIQS. They have put in their request for proposals, just like the UK government did, asking proposals for infrastructure projects to be based on ICMS. And there have been training programs in Canada training all the firms to be able to provide ICMS work to the Canadian government. So ICMS was born 6 months ago, and it's already being taken up and used around the world. So it's just, I think, something that we can all be very proud of.
Merci, Ken. Antonio Paparella, l'ICMS
Antonio, ICMS is very recent. It recently came into being. So we've talked about it from an intra-European Union standpoint, but extra-European standpoint is a very important aspect as well, because construction projects can obviously be outside of the borders of Europe. So, and there are fantastic opportunities there, fantastic markets, so project managers must be aware of these standards, and investors, and so do investors outside the borders of Europe, right? Absolutely. I'd say, well, I'll share with you 2 points there. We have cooperation and development funds with which we work as sponsors in a number of countries, and therefore the ICMS standards can help in setting a common base or common basis for the public procurement markets required to finance these markets on a level playing field across a variety of across operators. And the second point, as a result of this promotion, will consist in, for this standard to give a possibility, an opportunity for EU businesses to access these markets on a level playing field versus international operators or local operators. Indeed, promotion plays a significant role, both in terms of the way we approach the definition of projects and decision pertaining to projects. This promotion should also take into account the operational aspects for the application of methods. I think classification and the fact of presenting a common classification as well as presenting costs in a harmonized way is one thing that is really important. Indeed. Nevertheless, we need to make sure that the sources of information that we use to establish those costs are reliable and convergent. So information and the data that Pascal mentioned, if we look forward, because you're involved in operational works, research and development, we've mentioned several versions, there'll be a number of versions, and it's been since the start of ICMS. Could we imagine that this will be the final question? At the end of the day, will markets, geographical markets around the world that will be using ICMS, will these be a growth levers for and a driving force in the construction industry for these businesses? So the commercial aspects of this, the standard rationalization, transparencies for investors, which are underlined, Pascal. There can be certain markets which where corruption is rife. Now, could this be a commercial lever? I'm using ICMS, and for my businesses, my country, this is a commercial business or growth lever. So, from a commercial standpoint, so what do you reckon? As I stated earlier, absolutely. I had to compete in my own countries by Anglo-Saxon, by English colleagues, because they didn't recognize our own standards. So we need to overcome this fear. and they are fantastic success stories. The United Arab, the Emirates just use this as a basis. So other countries have opted for the same alternatives. So this can just reassure the market. Of course, I'm a strong believer in that as a driving force of development. So this develops the market. Alain Hughes.
I think the use of ICMS in emerging and developing economies is an important point, as we've already touched upon. But the issue is that in many of these emerging markets, no standards exist at all in terms of cost classification to the level that ICMS promotes. So I was having a discussion with an ICMS trustee member, actually, who works in Africa this morning before this conference, and he was telling me that foreign investment work that was coming into that country, if he could say to them that there was an international standard that could be used and recognised, and it is recognised by a number of end users already, as we've said, then that was a boon towards his SME involvement in that project. So the other point about this is that local practices and local SMEs in emerging economies and, in fact, mature economies can benefit from ICMS because, of course, most of them are part of an extended supply chain vis-a-vis the larger global consultancies anyway, but also it levels the playing field between the large consultancies and themselves. So I think there's two issues here. One is that ICMS is even more important in developing and emerging economies, and secondly, SMEs should not feel that they're excluded from the use of ICMS because it's actually a potential advantage for them.
Merci, Alain.
Maybe if you want to share a few words by way of a conclusion, final words, final comments before we wrap up, Antonio. Well, thank you very much, first of all, to organizing this debate, this session. It is important to underline the importance of CMS at the European and international levels, and I can only but encourage this work driven by the coalition. First of all, to complete the work that's already been started and put underway with the life cycle cost, including social costs as well, maybe a good addition. So how do we translate this into standards? That's an important point. What about exploring these in the future after completing the work to be completed? Maybe what about exploring other avenues, maybe with the social dimension? Yes, Pascal, maybe a few words by way of a conclusion. Simply, well, you know, as CMS after 5 years, we're done with the nappies. We need to learn to walk, and then we need to learn to fly. Thank you very much. Should you have any questions, any reactions, please, any comments, please do not hesitate. So I have a question on the, how is environment taken into account in these standards? I'd like to put aside what was said on the necessity of standards as discussed by Mr. ASSELIN as essential to reassure the client, because obviously this is, the matter between the ignorant and the experts. Right, I'd like to focus on to get your views on when we think that money does not exist. Money is a just convention. So when Mr. Creighton, you want to put at disposal tools that, okay, this will be helpful to the population, it is going to cost that amount of money, but the cost is like virtual, it doesn't really exist. In the building industry, we are in the physical world, when we are on the physical planet, and the cost is not particularly to be taken into account in terms of its monetary cost, but the cost that is in terms of energy. So how do these standards, how can these standards take into account environmental aspects? Just to give you an example, when in France, it is cheaper to get exotic wood windows from China, although we have local forests right next to our doors with people in trades who are experts in windows, and then some cannot make that choice of local sourcing simply because this is, from a financial point of view, this is not this is not a reasonable choice. So I'll obviously I'll hand it over to you, but ICMS, we will talk about cost because we are within a forum of construction economists. So, but the ICMS is a standard. It's like an Esperanto, a common language to calculate quantities and order those quantities. Then we can demultiply it for carbon footprint calculation. That's what I meant. And then what you said about the cost, that everything revolves around money, but no, I might not be competent in answering this, but maybe the Labour will talk about this again this afternoon with the A plus and minus. We haven't got any other comparative tools. Well, precisely, if you want to pick up on the issue of cost, saying that these are only quantities is not too complicated to find them. But then in that case, so in that case, how do we put in place standards? Was about trying to make these standards evolve with we talk about concrete, but there's sand as well. Sand is now missing. There's kind of mafia. Mafia operators are starting to kill for sand. Now we're thinking, okay, what about building with wood? That has started developing. But with Beam and Revit, we've got the issue of standards, and the problem is that standards locks our thinking opportunities and does not allow us to evolve along with the physical world. Standards which is too restrictive. Who wants to pick up on that one?
Le standard qui est trop restrictif, en fait.
Yeah, of course, good environmental decisions is key to building construction, and I think that's accepted. But actually, ICMS is not just about cost. It's about better decision-making using the data that the standard demands. So along with costs, we determine a number of values and attributes which will aid decision-making in terms of good environmental practice. And it's about, at the end of the day, obtaining that data in a harmonized form in order to make those comparisons and make those decisions. I mean, for example, floor area, which IPMS covers, is a major determinant of environmental sustainability in terms of buildings. And you may say, well, that's obvious and simple, but it's actually nevertheless pretty critical in terms of having a consistent way to measure that floor area to compare environmental performance across the world. And obviously ICMS requires IPMS floor areas to be part of the values and attributes that are described with the costs. So ICMS is not just about costs and cost classification. It's also about collecting the essential components and values that are associated with that particular development or construction cost. And just one other point in terms of the environmental debate, because I think that when we're looking at life cycle costs, those decisions and getting those early decisions factored into design decisions are absolutely key. And again, we need the information in a harmonized, consistent form in order to achieve that. And you also mentioned technology and BIM models. One of the things about ICMS is that it does allow, because it tends to follow the major design disciplines in buildings and infrastructure, one of the things it allows is easier cross-fertilization of data between cost and design, and also because it's collected at a high level. So I think in terms of obtaining the optimum solution for a building, you need international standards on the cost side that integrate well with design decisions, and that's what ICMS also aims to do.
If I can just add to that, I think it's a very good and important question. And just an example carrying on from what Alan said, IPMS, that I mentioned, property measurement standards, that give you just the simple size of a building. I had the opportunity to speak about this very point at COP21 in December 15 in this very city when the United Nations was looking at the goals for temperature rise. The point being that buildings are approximately 40% of global emissions. Heating and cooling and operating buildings is about 40% of our greenhouse emissions. Currently around the world, there is no consistent way to measure buildings. So you could have 10 people come into this room and they would give you 10 different sizes for this room, the square meters of this room, because they would measure to the outside of the wall or the inside of the wall, or is that a wall? Or so they'll say this is 60 square meters or 65 square meters. It's all different because they don't have the same standard. The energy usage to heat this room is a constant. If you're measuring it to be bigger, if you're saying this is 80 square meters or 100 square meters, the room will look efficient. You can't compare. So if the world is going to actually measure efficiency of buildings and a comparative way to reach these goals, we have to have a consistency in how we measure. This is the denominator of the math, right? Energy is consistent, but if buildings keep getting bigger and bigger, then they look like they're more efficient, but they're not, okay? This is why we have to have consistent international standards in land, construction, property, so that people can make good, I said business decisions before, but also good environmental decisions and social welfare decisions and political decisions. So if you look at something like LEED or BREEAM or Neighbors or all these sustainability standards, they all have different or no standard in relation to the issues we're discussing. We need those standards to adopt this so that they can make good comparisons. The work we're doing is very important for the environment.
Just in addition to that, just a few points. It is important to highlight what Alan has just said, the importance of having contextual elements with cost. So ICMS presents results for the purpose of investment, but beyond all of these considerations, there's a presentation. This is about presenting cost, but as in all construction projects, we have risk analysis, risk related to decision making. So it all depends on the client and what the client wants. As to the various strategies, they intend to roll out investment strategies, their commitment to climate, energy challenges or environmental challenges, even so, and to see that in terms of these choices, and out of 2 or 3 options, and the point here is to see the impact in terms of cost. I think at ICMS, our role is not about saying, well, these are the options you have, but depending on the client's briefing, based on the client's briefing, it's about, how do certain choices will translate in terms of cost, and then we could complement these with a risk analysis. And this afternoon, we'll have a workshop on the level E+ and minus developed in France and in connection with RICS. This is an environmental label, low carbon of positive energy buildings. So everything will converge then, right? Tarmo Savonen, maybe you wanted to jump in?
Just a simple question. You said that the coalition owns the IPRs of ICMS. If I am a private company in Finland or a public organization in Finland, I would like to use ICMS. How do I do it? Do I have to ask permission from whom?
It's a good question. So the standard is free, and it's available on the website, ICMS-coalition.org. And the coalition, all the 48 organizations, we own the copyright, we own the intellectual property, and we set the price, and the price is 0, and it will always be 0. Now, the reason why we hold the copyright and the intellectual property is we don't want somebody to take it and change it and say that they are consistent with ICMS, because that would undermine our work. We also don't want somebody to take it and claim it to be theirs and cause confusion in the marketplace. So we have the legal right to protect its integrity. But there is an absolute commitment, and we're doing this in practice, to ensure that it can be used. So if somebody wants to take the standard and put it in a training course and make money off it, that is fantastic. And they owe us no royalty, no money, that's free. We want them to do that. That is good to get the standard out there and used. If a company wants to use the standard in their work, as you just described, that is fantastic. That is our goal. We want it used. So we are doing this genuinely as a public service, and also because we are professional organizations and we need to have professional outcomes. And so we also want clients not just to get the standard, but to think, okay, who is best qualified to do this work? And so that's when they would come to your organization in Finland and hire members of your organization because they're trained to do this work, right? But to answer your question, it's free. So we're sponsoring this equally amongst ourselves.
S'il y a d'autres questions, réactions dans la salle, n'hésitez pas.
Any additional questions in the room? No, such is not the case. Ken, Antonio, Pascal? Oh, there's a question there. Thank you. As there are very few women in the room, I think it's good for women to be active. This is about standardization. You see, you're all men, all standard. So thank you very much, Mr. CREIGHTON, for his response. I think it is important, very important what you do. And it's like a quantum physicist conferences to define what a second is and to develop a common language. Just to pick up on what was then said before you jumped in, well, the copyrights issue is an important one. So my question is, what about your funding? Where does that come from? Who funds you?
Le développement de la coalition.
For the development of the coalition. This is on a volunteer basis. So Mr. CREIGHTON is a volunteer, is he? In every organization you have permanent members, but in every organization has taken care of travel costs. So we have one face-to-face meeting once a year in the country. And the rest of it is related to conference calls on a monthly basis, so we don't have to pay people to set up ICMS. This is a professional expertise.
C'est l'expertise des professionnels. Il n'y a pas de consulting.
Trustees, how many trustees? Maybe there's 80 and 90 people. So every country in the coalition becomes a trustee, and then we held a college of experts following democratic meeting or voting. So they work in camera and then openly to forward the result, the outcome of their work, and then we can decide whether or not we want to amend or adjust. So, in short, that's it's basically time spent. Even Europe didn't give a single euro except for coffee and putting a room at our disposals. There was a meeting in Brussels, so all this has been put at the disposal of ICMS. This is about sharing of expertise, right?
I can clarify. So I work for RICS. I'm a salaried member of RICS staff. And exactly as Pascal and Antonio said, RICS, I do this as part of my day job. And from a coalition viewpoint, it's free. I'm literally a volunteer. And so it's all exactly as they said. But keep in mind that it's cheaper to work together to write one standard than it is for 50 organizations to all independently write 50 standards, right? Okay, so working together in this way, I'd like to think we are saving resources. It's good for the environment.
It's a version.
And there are lots of female trustees and females on the standard setting committees as well. And I'm sorry they're not on the stage right now.
Okay. S'il y a d'autres interventions parmi vous, n'hésitez pas.
Any additional questions? No such another case. Well, thank you very much for your contribution. Thank you very much to our speakers for this workshop, a most informative one at that. Thank you very much.